Hi, welcome to the Lockdown LitFest. I'm Simeon Courtie, and I'm very pleased you've joined us for an interview with an author who is a friend of the LitFest. Fans of this particular literary festival will know him well. He's a man I and all parents owe a great debt of thanks to for being the creative force behind Bob the Builder. You've heard about his artistic background and his journey through art college, I'm sure, before. And I'm very interested to talk to him about what happened beyond that and how his love of horror and fantasy led him to create whole worlds of werewolves and dead people and things that you would generally consider might be a challenge to write, certainly for a younger audience. So we're going to talk about all of that and more with Curtis Jobling. Welcome, Curtis. How are you?
Good, thank you. Cheers for the nice introduction, Simeon. Good to be back.
It's lovely to have you here and in your shed. Can you just describe where you're talking to us from?
I say shed, it's more than that, really. A friend of mine who's a designer, he's an engineer, he designed and built it for me. So it's got double glazing, it's cavity wall insulated. If there was plumbing in here, I'd never leave. But yeah, this is, on this wall we have kind of Bike Beatniks, which was an art show that I did, which was also an animated series that we were developing. And also a range of vinyl art toys. We've got some early Bob the Builder stuff here, designs for other models, a print from Batman the Animated Series, which I'm a huge fan of. And just here, I don't know if you can see it or not, we've got Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker's autograph as well. So yeah, this is where I come for inspiration, and also it's a place to hide from my family as well.
What an amazing den. It's like the ultimate writer's den. Is it where you write, or is this literally just your escape pod?
It is where I write. I mean, since lockdown started, and I know a lot of writers and creatives have struggled to find the inspiration and the time and the kind of the drive to get on with their writing and their creativity. It's actually genuinely proved a place that I can go to get my head in gear. Or it's already a few steps away from the house, so I can step away from there anyway, and it feels like I'm going to work. But yeah, since my daughters came home from school and my wife is working from the house as well, it's kind of pushed me to be a bit more productive with my time. There's not quite as much procrastination going on as there has been in the past. So yeah, I'm getting in here and I'm getting some work done. There's a lot of script writing going on at the moment, which is taking up my time. So yeah, I've never spent more time in here.
I'm really fascinated to talk about the script writing and the adaptation process that you're going through at the moment. So we're going to get to that a bit later on.
Yeah.
I find that really interesting that you're staying creative and that you've just mentioned you recognize some people are struggling with that. I was literally just having this conversation with someone else at the LitFest about how the pandemic and the lockdown isn't doing what I thought it would do. You spend your whole life fighting for time to write, and you would think, being told by the government you can't leave the house, you'd get your novel finished, you'd start so many new projects. And it's having the opposite effect, certainly with me and with other writers I know. And I don't know why that's happening, whether it's just what's going on in the world is too big a distraction. But you're clearly aware of that. Have you had a moment? Have you had a wobble? Has it interrupted your flow?
Have you found out you've hit a wall with your writing, with your kind of word count and stuff like that? Is it just...
I can't get excited about it. And I really hope that isn't because the projects that I'm working on are rubbish.
It's not about a pandemic.
I'm kind of hoping it's not. I hope it's the fact that we're in the middle of the biggest story for 100 years. I'm hoping that's the distraction. But your shed and your steps away from home are enough for you, right?
I think I work best when there are people at home. It's quite strange. It's hard to explain, I suppose. Most writers, even though I've got the solitude and the escape of the shed to write in, I always used to write better when, for example, when I first wrote the Wereworld series, when I was working on that series, I'd spent years working in the film and TV industry, working in a production office in the art department, and having people to chat with throughout the day. And then when I wrote the Wereworld books, my wife was actually at home. We'd not long had our youngest daughter, so she was raising her as well in the daytime whilst I was getting on with the writing. And I found I was more productive when there were people in the house with me. I probably struggle a little bit more when I'm left alone. I think that's when I start getting distracted by things and pottering and pootling around and loading the dishwasher or walking the dogs or whatever it might be, eating Jaffa cakes. Other savoury biscuits are available, by the way, as well. But yeah, I found that when my wife and my daughters all came home because of lockdown, it suddenly gave me a bit of a spur. You know, this is going to go on for quite a while, and having them there meant that I couldn't procrastinate, if that makes sense. Couldn't hide the fact that I had work to do and writing to get on with. And it also coincided with a push from my collaborators, the studios and stuff, asking for me to get on with the writing as well, with scripts and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of a perfect storm to push me into doing my writing, which has been really good, and I've enjoyed it. That you know, that's obviously a key element of it. But yeah, speaking to other writers, they're struggling. They're finding it hard to find the energy and the sort of inspiration to get up and go. I even had an email from the Society of Authors. I'm a committee member of the Children's Writers and Illustrators group with the SOA, and they've asked me to do a little vox pops to hopefully inspire other writers to say, this is how I'm getting through lockdown. It's completely normal to struggle in times like this, that they're extraordinary. So I'm going to, once we're done here today, I'll probably do that for them and send it over as well.
That's great. And you know what? That's going to be so reassuring for people watching this who are in that place right now, sort of hitting that wall. So thank you for sharing that and being so encouraging. Weirdly, I think the reason that the organisers of LitFest put us together for this little interview is because we sort of share weirdly common ground, because I came up as a broadcaster through children's television, introducing the kind of shows that you were part of creating. And my most recent work is horror, and of course you're massively into that horror fantasy genre as well. It's that part, because we've spoken on the LitFest with you before about the Bob the Builder and the artist's journey. Talk to me about where the horror started. I read Haunt, obviously, and so I know that a part of that kind of Warrington setting is your childhood. At what point did you get excited by horror? Can you remember?
Oh God, that's I've never been asked that. What was the first thing I saw that scared me and inspired me? I think it was probably as a child watching the Ray Harryhausen movie, Jason and the Argonauts, where the Hydra's teeth are cast onto the ground. And it's fantasy and it's horror in equal measure, obviously, with it being the Greek myths. But the teeth get cast onto the ground, and out of the ground rise the squadron of skeletons. That inspired me in many ways. I fell in love with monsters, I fell in love with Greek myths, and I fell in love with stop motion animation. So that's a very vivid early memory for me. And I went on to pursue all those things in the years that followed. The real sort of frightening, the horror things that stayed with me, it tended to be cinema. So it was the old Universal Studios, things like Lon Chaney's Wolfman. As a kid, seeing that scared me witless. Didn't help much seeing an American Werewolf when I was an early teen as well. And we're probably of an age, but when Salem's Lot was shown on TV, the scene with Danny Glick at the window and the tap, 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 drifting and floating there.
That's singularly the most frightening part of the novel as well. It's the part of that book that I read as a 15-year-old and was utterly shocked by.
Because you are, and especially he's kind of King there channeling himself as a teenager, isn't he? And the fear that he would have felt, profound. And it stayed with me, and I know it stayed with so many other people as well. So that was where the horror love really came from. And I used to love the first sort of horror books I read. They were kind of it was James Herbert. He was my go-to writer as a teenage boy. James Herbert, bless him. God rest his soul and everything. He as a writer, he inspired generations as well. But his early books, there was always that, people who'd accuse him of being a bit crude and graphic and quite unnecessary in places. They were those books that they always used to fall open on a certain page when you picked them up from the library, and you knew there'd be something there for the dads. That was the James Herbert books were kind of seminal for me to read. But I remember reading in quick succession the Rats, Lair and Domain, and you see him grow as a writer through those three books. He suddenly becomes a master of his craft by the time he gets to the third book, which starts with a wonderful sort of montage scene of these post-apocalyptic moments where the bomb is dropped and London is wiped out. That was incredible for me, seeing a writer grow over those three books over a span of time. So yeah, Herbert was a big inspiration for me as a young fan of horror literature, definitely.
So in preparing for this interview, I knew of your work, obviously, but I'd never read the Wereworld series. So I've been reading Rise of the Wolf. And I think I'm right in the chronology of your career, that came after you'd done some YA kind of more kind of spooky dooky stuff like the Haunt book, which I've got here. So how embedded was that concept in your mind of creating the vastness of a fantasy realm that Wereworld is, with its complexities and its royal bloodlines and rivalries and a wealth of characters? It's huge. Has that been with you for a while, or did you kind of get to a point in your career and think, okay, here we go, I've established myself, it's time for the big one?
It's safe to say that my love of storytelling started with my, obviously my love of reading, but also as a teenager, it was playing Dungeons and Dragons, it was role-playing games with my pals. And even when I went to art college to study illustration, I was still, I used to, a couple of nights a week, I would run these huge, epic role-playing games. The 2 years that I was at art college doing my diploma in illustration, the first year we were there, I ran a huge Lord of the Rings, Middle-earth role-playing game with a bunch of characters spanning the whole map of Middle-earth and epic battles and storylines of my own creation. And then in the second year at college, I ran a Lovecraftian game, Call of Cthulhu. But it was more kind of, rather than being the traditional Lovecraftian works, there were elements of that, but it was more Fortune and Glory, Indiana Jones, gangsters, Tommy guns, werewolves and vampires. So it was a real mixing pot, a melting pot of a kind of a genre mashup before genre mashups existed, I believe.
It's all. I think it's all. Have you noticed as well how when we were growing up? So as you reference in your books, if you were growing up in the 80s and 90s and were doing role play games and Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, you would definitely niche to the point of nerd. And then the look back element of that has become so hip now. I mean, I feel a lesser person because I didn't do any of that stuff. With things like Stranger Things is a good example. A Netflix original that becomes a worldwide hit, and the core characters are all engulfed in that fantasy world. It's become hip to have done that, almost sort of accidentally. And yet that is the world you were in, right? So when you're writing the characters in Haunt, for example,
you play D&D, yeah. It's quite weird, isn't it? Yeah, I was the nerd at school, undoubtedly. I mean, I tried to get, I managed to keep in with the cool kids as well, in so much as I was able to make them laugh, which therefore kept a pummeling and a beating at arm's length. So being, quite charming and cheeky and stuff helped me get out of all kinds of scrapes and smackdowns. But Friday nights when my other friends were hanging around the precinct drinking beer and stuff, me and a select group of fellow geeks were getting together and trawling through dungeons and digging up treasure and things like that. That was where I kind of learnt my chops as a writer, and that was where years later, obviously doing the stuff at college, I was telling these huge stories. And many of my friends who now work in film and TV and publishing and comics, who went to art college with me, they have very fond memories of those days as well at art college, where we'd pull these huge all-nighters with me running these games. And it inspired them. It made them kind of go on to work in these fields. A good pal of mine, Ian Coulbard, a wonderful graphic novelist and writer. He works for 2000 AD. He has done graphic novels of many of H.P. Lovecraft's works and sort of Conan Doyle works as well. He was part of that playing group. And I think if we hadn't have played that game in the second, he probably wouldn't have gone down that avenue years later. So that inspires us. That's where I learned to tell stories. That was the thing that always kind of drove me. It was through role-playing games. Where the idea for Wereworld came from, I always had the idea of an epic fantasy story. And some years back, my wife and I were living on top of the North Yorkshire moors, and I had the beginnings of a story that I wanted to write, which was Wereworld, and it'd been bubbling for quite a while. I was walking my spaniel on top of the moors, and a fog came in and descended over us, and I suddenly found myself cut off and a bit disoriented. I didn't know whereabouts north and south was, and all of a sudden, all I could think of was American Werewolf. And I'd gone up there to think about my fantasy story that I wanted to write, and then all of a sudden, I had this werewolf charging headlong into the fantasy story. And that's when I thought, oh, there's something there, isn't there? And I went away and I thought about it. And other elements kind of went into the melting pot as well. Obviously, I mean, people say that the comparisons between Game of Thrones and Wereworld. Wereworld was, when it was launched by Penguin in San Diego Comic-Con in 2011, Penguin described it as Game of Thrones for teenagers featuring werewolves.
Yeah.
Good description, although there is only the one werewolf in there. There isn't half as much incest as you'd imagine either. But there was also the Welsh legend of Beth Gellert, that legend which viewers should definitely investigate. The idea of somebody leaping to a terrible conclusion and a terrible deed, an awful deed happening that you can't take back, that directly inspired the opening chapters of Wereworld as well, undoubtedly. So that's where it comes from, definitely. It was that need to write an epic fantasy story, but with transformative horror elements in there as well.
Those elements were really engaging for someone who, because I'm not someone who reads a lot of fantasy at all, although horror, I guess, is part of that genre. But a misconception that this is a werewolf tale is just that, really. It's not that at all. There's so much more to it. The therianthrope, if I've pronounced that right, the idea of a whole cast of characters, some of whom have this ability to transform, and what their animal is, gives it so much wider depth than the kind of the American Werewolf in London kind of classic werewolf plot. I'm really interested to know, as someone who, it would boggle my mind to create something on the scale of the Wereworld books. What's your process for keeping tabs on it all? The families, the lands, where everything is. I'm sure you've shared with other authors how they do it. I remember reading a great article with J.K. Rowling about how she mapped out, she kind of had like the school calendar for every single year and what had happened when, so she would know that, oh no, they can't have done that then because they haven't learned that yet. It's boggling.
I think you're informed by the genre that you love as a writer. You probably are, with your love of horror inspiring your writing as well. So I think those elements, it's the cliche of you write what you know, but for me, I knew fantasy because I'd played so many huge epic fantasy games over the years, and I'd set my own stories in motion in these role-playing games where I had these huge worlds. So world building is it's an element that is necessary for any fantasy novel, because it's an element that you use in any fantasy game as well. So I knew that in order to write a good fantasy story, it would need to have a convincing world. And that came as second nature to me because of having played these role play, the hobby thing leading into a career. That hobby had informed me as how to create that world with the writing. So, well, the nice thing was that the feedback I got from many reviews was it was a really convincing world building in the Wereworld books. Captured something there, which I think only comes from the fact that misspent youth playing games, disappearing for hours at a time into those fantasy worlds, that informed me as a writer and helped me to create convincing and compelling worlds as well.
And do you ever have the moment in book 6 where you kind of go, oh man, I can't remember whether they would know that, but then do you have any, catalogue of facts and dates?
Yeah, I would map things out carefully with each book, and at the beginning of each book, my editor and I, certainly as we got onto kind of book 3 and 4, I think it was, we decided that we would have not exposition, but at the beginning of the book, there'd be a kind of an up sum of who the royal families were, how they were connected, the different sides, the different allegiances. So we'd go through a living or deceased, so we could work out who was still standing. And then we'd go through that, and that's at the beginning of each book. So there's, readers who come cold to the series and pick up the 4th book, they could theoretically read the opening to the book and find out very quickly what's happened in the previous volumes, and also who the different sort of sides are that are fighting this war, and where their allegiances lie. So yeah, we had to do that to kind of keep a track on it. But yeah, a lot of it was left to me to kind of remember. And revisiting it now, as I am doing with development, there's loads that I'm forgetting, and I'd pick out little things. I think I wish I'd done that slightly differently.
Give me an example.
Just little things, just certain characters. I could have made this character a little, given it a bit more of an edge, made it a little bit more woke, for example, for want of a more sort of a cheesy word for that. But certain characters had opportunities to be a little bit more interesting that I missed first time round. Not many, I wouldn't say, but just a certain one or two. And what I'm doing is, it is a semi-secret, but I am adapting Wereworld now for broadcast. I am adapting it. I'm not doing it. It's not page to screen straight. We are changing elements of it in order to make it work, because it's 10 years old now. It came out in 2011, the first book. And I've obviously grown as a writer in that time. So we're trying to make sure that the book will appeal to the broadest. The TV show of this will appeal to the broadest audience possible. So we're making little elements, none of which are to the detriment of the book, but they just add layers, many layers to it. There's a lot more in there than you would expect, or you know, it's going to surprise and hopefully delight lovers of the book.
Where are the main challenges for you as an author of the original material in being asked to develop it for television? It's a joy that most authors wouldn't get. You would normally hand the book over, take some money, and hope they didn't ruin it too badly. That puts a bit of pressure on, I would guess. But where do you think the challenges are?
It's knowing where your line is, what you're prepared to, what you feel is cannot change and be twisted from the original source material, and sticking to your guns on that front. You're right, not many authors do get the chance to actually work on and adapt their novels into screenplays or what have you. In fact, brighter, cleverer minds than mine will tell you that never do it. So obviously you'll know Alan Moore, the graphic novelist and comic book writer. Many of his books have been made into films with mixed success, or varied degrees of. But he always says, he just finds, you know, that they're nothing to do with the book. They're nothing. That's the film. This is the book. You want a film based upon my book, you can go and watch it, but it's got nothing to do with me. He happily takes the check for the option and the purchase, and then he just walks away. But I know other authors, friends of mine, who have written very successful middle grade fantasy novels and what have you. One who will remain unnamed for now, but he's a lovely chap, and it was his life's work was this series of novels which were really successful. They got optioned by Hollywood, these particular books, to be turned into a movie. They're set in the northwest of England in a kind of the time of the witch trials, and so they're kind of not medieval, but sort of late 17th century kind of fantasy yarns with monsters and boggarts and things like that in. And I remember him meeting me at a festival, the author, and he was saying to me, "Oh, Curtis, I was going to pick your advice. You've worked in film and TV. I've got this deal to make my book into a film. I'm not happy with how it's going." And I said, "Well, I think you've just got to step away, really. If you're not happy, you know, you've signed your deal." He said, "Yeah, but it's not a great deal." And I said, "Well, it's what's done is done. They're going to develop it how they want to. For your own sanity, I think you've got to take a step back and just let that run its course now, because it's its own thing." And I think a lot of authors struggle to get their head around that. Not long after that, I went to see one of his talks and another festival, and he was showing, rather than talking about the new books, he was just talking about how the Hollywood film was systematically destroying his beloved baby. He was showing screenshots on his PowerPoint. "Look at this, would you?" And he, with his broad Lancashire accent, he was saying, "Look at that." He said, that's supposed to be Preston Docks. It looks like bloody Rivendell." I was in tears at the side of the stage, thinking, he hasn't taken a word of my advice. He's got on a kind of, he's crashed on. And yeah, he was right. It did look like Rivendell. It looked nothing like Preston. Such is life. I think you've just got to, if you work in publishing and your book gets optioned, if you get the chance to work on it, great. But keep your powder dry, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, because it's going to change. Invariably it does. The nice thing in my instance is, because of my background in television from in the animation industry for many years and working on production and either designing other people's shows or creating my own, my collaborators in this instance had actively said to me, we'd like you to take the first crack at this and see how we get on. And as things are going, it's worked really well. I've got great producers I'm working with. The feedback I get is just as helpful as what you'd get from an editor in publishing as well. So yeah, we're making real headway with it and staying true to the source material. As I say, changing elements here and there to give it extra layers of excitement as well.
And for those authors watching who write fantasy, they'll be watching this because it's you. So can you give them a little steer on pitfalls that you've encountered? Maybe just take on the role of the classic fantasy mentor. Guide them through the dark forest for a moment. What are the pitfalls they need to look out for when they're writing maybe their first fantasy novel?
I think it was only after I'd written my first book, the first Wereworld book, that I was made aware of what a trope was. I was like, what, a trope? And there's a website there. Well, there's many websites, but one which is basically dedicated to tropes of fantasy. I think,
and you discovered you'd written them all.
I'd shoehorned every single trope of fantasy into my, no, not quite, but everything bar the kitchen sink. There was quite a few of them in there. There were certain elements. So kind of, the farm boy at the beginning, which is basically Luke Skywalker. It's the same.
Skywalker, yeah.
And the hidden power, which is Luke, it's a Jedi. In my case, he's a werewolf. The terrible loss at the beginning, which is obviously in Luke's case, it's his Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. In Wereworld, it's something quite close to home for Drew as well. The journey, the encounters, everything's lost. All those different elements which you find in a classic tale, they're kind of there. I think if you were writing fantasy, don't be afraid if those things are in there. If readers of fantasy always want to find something new. It's very hard to tell something entirely. There's very few things original under the sun. I think the challenge for authors in fantasy and in any field genre really is finding a fresh voice for telling those familiar tales. And fantasy, because there are so many classics of their kind out there, from the epics of Tolkien through to the modern sort of grim, darker epics of George R. R. Martin, Joe Abercrombie. They kind of bite back against the tropes. They pervert them. They turn them on their heads, so that the things that readers think they're going to get isn't what's going to happen. Yeah. So even those, that legerdemain, the trick, the surprise that the reader's not expecting, or that's something that they're expecting now in their books, in fantasy novels. They expect the unexpected now. I think definitely. Yeah, Song of Ice and Fire has changed the playing field for everybody, I think, in that regard. It's raised the game for many fantasy writers as well.
I think that's really reassuring to hear you say that about those classic things that you saw in your own first work, hadn't realised you were doing, and then discovered, oh, that's familiar. There's a book here on my show. You'll know this book because it's a bit of an old sort of writer's Bible, really. I sometimes refer to it when I'm kind of coaching people on structuring. The Joseph Campbell book, or The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And then
but I think I probably need to get that.
He was a philosopher back in the 1940s. It's a bit of a weighty read on myths and legends and how they all have the same story framework. And then it's been reworked a million times by a million different people into basically the hero's journey. So the things you talk about there about atoning for the father and all of these stages. And I find it really reassuring to hear you kind of say it's okay if that stuff happens, that's okay. And books like that prove it, that stories have worked to a certain rhythm for thousands of years, but we don't pick up a book and go, oh, not this again, because it's the tone of voice, isn't it? And there are so many other things that you can bring into it.
Yeah, without naming names, there are some modern fantasy writers who I absolutely adore, but I know in my heart of hearts that the story is familiar. I kind of see where things are going. I can project ahead and work out what's happening. But we know that because we're seasoned readers and writers and our love of literature. But I'm still going to go on that journey because I'm enjoying what we're finding out along the way as well. I'm never going to make any, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel with my writings. There's very few writers out there who really do break that wheel and do something profoundly different to what else has gone before. But I want to write epic fantasy and horror, and I think epic fantasy horror readers know what they want to read. Hopefully it's my books as well.
Okay, let's move from the Wereworld universe to something that you're also adapting for TV. So this is a timely thing to talk about. Not new, but brilliant. Two of your YA books are the Haunt series. The first one I'm holding up here, Haunt, Dead, Scared. I'm going to ask you to read a little extract from this in a moment. But first of all, tell me about the heart of this story and where it came from. Because I ask you that because it's set in your hometown. So I'm guessing it was something that allowed you to dig into that part of your history.
Yeah, it's set a world away from Wereworld. It's set within our world, my world in particular, which would be Warrington. It's based very loosely on my life growing up in Warrington in the 1980s. I say loosely because the hero dies in the opening chapter, and it's about two best friends. It's a bromance. Will and Dougie, they go everywhere together. It's yin and yang. It's Ant and Dec. It's Eric and Ernie, and they're role players. They play D&D. They're the nerds. They're me and my friends. But yeah, in the opening chapter of the book, Will is killed in a hit and run accident and comes back and haunts Dougie. And Dougie can't chase it. He can't get rid of him. He's like his shadow following him everywhere he goes, which at first seems quite amusing, but quickly becomes very annoying, especially when Dougie's maybe trying to go to the toilet in peace or have a shower. So yeah, the two of them they realise the only way to maybe help Will move on from being stuck in limbo is to meet another real ghost, unlike Will, and get there. So they go to an old schoolhouse, which legend says is haunted. They encounter the ghost there. She scares them witless and they run away. But they come back the next day and they befriend her. Her name is Phyllis, and she's a ghost from a girl from the 1960s. She's been haunting this old schoolhouse, which is due to be demolished. She's been haunting it for 50 years, so long that she can't remember how she died. So Will and Dougie think if they can work out how she died, maybe they can free her and she can move on. So they start digging. They discover the reason that Phyllis hasn't moved on is because her killer is very much alive, very much well, and very much an active member of their community. And that's when my comedy ghost story actually becomes a murder mystery. So that was all inspired by the things I saw, the legends, urban legends and stuff that went around my hometown when I was a kid. A lot of those elements are in there, including other haunted sites and places which pop up throughout the story as well. They're based on things many of them that I encountered as a kid. And I draw on things that I love from local legends from across the UK as well. I draw those in where they're going to work as well.
The reveal of Phyllis in the book is a genuine kind of it's a joyous moment. It was one of those kind of laugh out loud moments, because I think they're reading the name off an old photograph on the wall, and they're sort of finding the girl, and they read the name, and as the boys read the name in this dark, dusty old haunted house, and then they read the name out loud, and then a voice from the door goes, "Yes," and she's standing. I thought that was brilliant. I love the way you've woven so much humor into it, and that kind of Boise 13-year-old humor is just beautifully woven throughout the whole thing. Were there any challenges for you in dealing with something that is paranormal, therefore scary in places, knowing it was for a young adult audience?
Well, I think young adult, it's quite a broad church anyway, so we're appealing to the top end of middle grade with haunts, and then lovers of kind of ghost stories as we progress as well. But it's principally, I would say, it's the bottom end of young adult as a target audience. The challenge was to stay relevant, I think, when I was writing it, and because, as you'll know, anything to do with teenagers, it goes out of fashion very, very quickly. So my references to Star Wars and stuff like that, they work for me and you and people our generation, but kids today are like, give it a rest, Dad. Don't mention Star Wars. Don't mention Harry Potter. No, it's not cool.
All right, boomer.
Yeah, exactly. So I wrote the book the way I thought it would make sense. Now, adapting it for television, I'm having to be really. I'm collaborating with a great writer on this as well, who is a television comedy writer, and we're really going back into it, and we're trying to make sure that it's relevant. B, the kids feel like kids today, rather than the kids of 20 odd years ago. So that's providing its own challenges as well. I'm running things by my 18-year-old son and my 14-year-old daughter, saying, what would you say in this situation? Is this fair to say? But yeah, it's difficult. And developing a book which it has some mild profanity in there, nothing great, but to make it relevant to a young adult audience today who watch television, the stuff they watch is a lot edgier, it's a lot racier, profanity, drug use, sexual content, all those things teenagers expect to see in their television these days. So we have to work out how we develop this book, stay faithful to it, and who our audience is, and also think ahead of who's our broadcaster going to be. They're the challenges that we're facing with it. What we are writing is very funny, it's very scary, it's tragic, it's got all those elements, but everything goes up to 11 kind of thing with the new version of it.
Can we hear a bit? Can you read an extract from the source material?
Absolutely. I'll just go through I'll just do the first chapter. It's only a couple of pages long, as you know. So Yeah, the first chapter is called First and Last. They say everyone has their soulmate. I found mine in preschool. Actually, mine found me would be closer to the truth. I didn't want to be there. Who would? I'd been ripped away from my mother's comforting embrace and forced into a realm of random toddlers and tantrums. Admittedly, on this occasion, I was a toddler having the tantrum, having been abandoned by mum. But that's beside the point. One inmate chose to take pity on me. It could have been the injustice of my plight that had drawn him to me. Perhaps my righteous bawling had struck a chord of brotherly love. I discovered 10 years later that he had his eye on my swanky new Ben 10 toy, but I won't quibble. I don't want to cheapen the moment. A quick hug, back pat, and exchange of an action figure later, our friendship was sealed. That was a big day for me and Dougie Hancock. We've been best mates ever since. 12 years later, heading for Dougie's house. I was aware I had a stupid grin plastered over my face. It had been there for the last 10 minutes. I laughed out loud as I pedalled, letting loose a brief woohoo that Homer Simpson would have been proud of. It had just gone 9 o'clock. St. Mary's church bells were tolling nearby. I was going to be late getting in. Dad would probably have something to say about that, especially on a school night. I didn't care. I had to get to Dougie's house. My good news couldn't wait. Not that he'd believe me, of course. I already knew he'd call me a liar, accuse me of having Munchausen syndrome. He might even say I was suffering from a head trauma, but still, I couldn't keep it to myself. I pedalled harder, my bicycle cutting up puddles, leaving spray in its wake. Weeknights, I tended to stay in, except on Thursdays when I went to Dougie's to play Dungeons & Dragons, listen to old indie albums. It's probably worth mentioning now that I was a bit of a geek, something the more mentally and emotionally challenged in school constantly mocked. Didn't like that my friends and I enjoyed role-playing games as a hobby, didn't have girlfriends, or the fact that we read books and were able to string sentences together. Our ability to walk upright with little difficulty no doubt really put their noses out of joint too. It helped that Dougie was an even bigger nerd than me. The two of us drew strength in this bond, this brotherhood of geekdom. People could call my mates and I whatever names they wanted. We let it roll off us like water from a kaiju's back. Dougie and I were best mates through thick and thin. He was a kindred spirit, the yin to my yang, the yang to my dad. Anyway, this chill November evening had been one I'd never forget. I'd spent it at the square, the local precinct, which was a hangout for many of the kids from school. In short, an intimidating place for a lad like me. I'm shy, a bit of an outsider, often looking in on social gatherings like my peers are speaking another language. I wouldn't ordinarily have been there, but somehow I plucked up the courage. Something had happened that turned my world upside down. It had been unexpected, it had been beautiful, it had blown my tiny mind. We are talking Death Star explosion here. There really was only one person I needed to spill my gossip to. I was fast approaching his house. It looked like an exciting new chapter in my life was just about to begin. Then again, fate can be a fickle beast. I never saw the vehicle that hit me. I was doing everything right, staying close to the curb, my lights on, both hands gripping the handlebars and brakes. It came out of nowhere. I heard the headlight shatter, felt my bicycle crumple against the bumper as I flew out of the saddle, hitting the bonnet with a bang. My body spun as the car sped on, impacting with the windscreen before rolling like a ragdoll over the roof. Then the vehicle was gone. My broken body was flying through the air. I was dead before I hit the tarmac. That's it. And obviously, yeah, poor fella. Never really recovers from that. The new world of the undead opens up to him.
Yeah, to find out what his news was, which is relevant to the story, you have to read the book. So Haunt, Dead Scared. Curtis, this has been an absolute pleasure, but we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us from your writer's den in that glorious shed. Good luck with the adaptations. We look forward to Wereworld featuring.
And your writing as well, Sim. Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm looking forward to the comedy of Haunt being on telly as well. And thank you, yes. And thanks for your reassuring words. I'm going to sort of wrap it up with those, really. Thank you for watching this interview. Stay safe, keep writing if you can. And as you've just heard from the great Curtis Jobling, if this lockdown is hitting the buffers and giving you some sort of mental lock, it's all right. Just keep checking out the LitFest and, you know, you'll be able to share in the angst with the rest of us. It's normal.
It's quite normal.
Thank you very much for watching.